Well, welcome everyone. What a special day. We are so honored to have Janice, who's sitting in the back there, and Bernie Rosner with us today. We've got a lot of people that moved from California. These are some extra special Californians that we're so glad to have here. Please take a moment and grab your cell phone and make sure that it's on Do Not Disturb or silent. We'd really appreciate that. And we really appreciate that you're here. And today we're paying tribute to the so many that were lost and try to imagine what it was like and to reflect, right? So between 1933 and 1945, the German government, led by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, carried out a systematic persecution and murder of Europe's Jews. This genocide is what we now know as the Holocaust. Some 6 million Jews were murdered. The Nazi regime also persecuted and killed millions of other people that they considered politically, racially, or socially unfit. It's estimated another 5 million. Hard to imagine. Germany was a democracy before this. As a country, it was respected for its scientists, its physicians, its theologians. But it descended into social collapse and world war and mass murder. All because an idea that one leader presented that Germany would be a superpower if it was comprised of only the Aryan race, which he believed was superior, and not only was the Aryan race better than any other race, but all of the people that did not belong to the Aryan race could be eliminated. So through propaganda and planning, he convinced a whole nation to be insensitive to Jews, to turn against their neighbors. It was a government-sponsored effort to build gas chambers in concentration camps. Imagine that. How did this happen? Well, as one death camp survivor said, "For evil to flourish, it only requires good men to do nothing." So the people that went along with this were ordinary men and women who followed orders, bystanders who did nothing, people who believed this dangerous lie that one race or one religion was superior to others. So today, by being here today, we're trying to understand how this horrific evil, which is even hard to comprehend, transpired, and to honor the lives lost, Bernie's family, and the millions of other victims. We're not looking away. We're being sensitive to the suffering of others. You are doing something. And this is also a way to honor the brave men and women of our military and of our allies who fought to end the World War and who freed the prisoners of the concentration camps. You can watch and listen to other Holocaust survivors, their testimonies on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum website. They're excellent. The link is on our Facebook page. I sent it out in a newsletter. And we have a book display of other books, and you can read more about Bernie's story after today. And he wrote that with a friend of his who was German, and it's called An Uncommon Friendship, and he'll tell you about this very unique book. It's an amazing read. And you can also borrow it from our library. You can get it on Amazon. And Janice brought some copies, which afterwards, if you have cash or a check, you can buy from her for $22, or you can put your name on a list and she can order you one. But today we have the special privilege of hearing from Bernie Rosner, a survivor, in person. Bernie and his family were Orthodox Jews who lived in southern Hungary. Bernie was just 12 years old when they were all sent to Auschwitz. Auschwitz? Is that right?
Auschwitz.
Auschwitz, there you go, in Poland. So today he's going to share what happened there and what happened to his family. Let's welcome him.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Great. Thanks, Ms. Gallardo, for the introduction. Thank you all for taking the time to come and listen to me, and hopefully give me a chance to answer some of your questions if you should have any, and if time permits. When I first talked to a group like this about my story, shortly after publication of the book in 2001, there were still a fair number of veterans of World War II in the audience. Some of them were part of units that liberated concentration camps of the kind that I was in, and at least one of them the very camp that I was in. I told them at the time that I owed them big time, since if they had arrived even a few days later, I would not be here talking to you today. During the 21 years, or actually now 22 years, that have passed since then, the number of such veterans has dwindled, and it won't be long before they will all be gone. The same is true about Holocaust survivors. I was just 12 years old when I was unloaded on the train platform at the Auschwitz concentration camp. And just a week ago, I, quote, celebrated my 91st birthday. I believe that there is some historic significance to the fact that the current generation of audiences will be among the last who will be hearing the story of those tumultuous and terrible days from the mouth of someone who actually has lived through them. While the early part of my life was dominated by turmoil, upheaval, and horror, most of the latter part of it was spent under slightly more benign conditions practicing law in California. The fact that I chose the law as a career is due to a number of reasons. But there is little question in my mind that after witnessing the breakdown of the basic norms of civilized behavior and the repudiation of the rule of law, tolerance, and human dignity, I was strongly drawn to a profession which ideally at least holds up as its goals the values that were so brutally trampled upon by perpetrators of the Nazi atrocities. For almost 40 years following the war, I put the events and memories of that earlier period out of my mind. During those intervening years, I've heard and read about Holocaust survivors and even their children who would not talk or think of the things that happened because the memories were too painful. I have to admit that this was not the case with me. I shut the past out simply because I considered it irrelevant. I was in a new country, starting a new life, and my focus has always been on the future, not the past. Then starting about the mid-1980s, 40 years after the war, two things happened that changed my attitude. First, I came to realize that you can't chop your life up into compartments and jettison those parts that you consider irrelevant. Your past is part of you, whether you like it or not. Second, as the representative of the Safeway supermarket chain for whom I worked and who was a major contributor, I attended the opening and dedication of the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1992. While there, I was given access to the archives, including the log of prisoners entering the Mauthausen concentration camp, the second camp I was in, to where I was transferred from Auschwitz in September of 1944. As I stared at the microfiche, there was the following entry for September 19, 1944. Bernat Rosner, prisoner number 103705, 103 705. As I looked at that banal, bureaucratic notation, the floodgates of memory and emotion opened and overwhelmed me. In that regard, you must remember that there is not a picture, document, or any other tangible thing that connects me to my former life. The upshot of these reflections and experience was a decision to tell my story. When I was ready to do so, a series of incidences, which are their own way as unique as any other aspect of my life, brought it about that I met and made friends with a man by the name of Fritz Tubach, whose background and history could not have been more different than mine. While I was a Jew and a survivor of Auschwitz, Fritz was raised in wartime Germany. His father was a Nazi, and Fritz himself, in his early youth, was a member of the Jugendvolk, the Cub Scout equivalent of the Hitler Youth. By the time we met in the 1980s, we had both become Americans. We both accepted the principle that you are responsible for your own actions and not for those of your father or other members of your race or nation. Over the years, we formed a friendship. We discovered that we both had fascinating stories to tell, and we decided to tell our stories together. The result was the book called An Uncommon Friendship. The reason for the title is obvious, which has enjoyed a fair degree of success, has been translated into German. I think the library has a copy of this. Has been translated into German, Italian, and Dutch, and which is the main reason why I am sitting before you today. The rest of what I have to say will consist mainly of telling you something about myself, where I came from, what I went through, and how I ended up where I did. I was born 91 years ago in a smallish town by the name of Tub in rural Hungary. For the first 12 years of my life, I had a basically normal and happy childhood. It was a very different childhood that young people have today. The town had, I think, 2 cars, one belonging to the landowner, one to the doctor. There was no outdoor plumbing. We didn't have electricity until I think I was about 7 or 8, but I never missed those things, and I basically had a happy childhood. An important part of my personality and makeup was shaped by the rigor and discipline of a Jewish Orthodox upbringing and a sensitive and literate mother. Both of these influences imbued me with an abiding love for books and learning. Anti-Semitism was certainly not unknown in Hungary, and it existed in a good measure in our town going back as far as I can remember. It was institutional in terms of laws that restricted the freedom of Jews from practicing certain professions or owning land, and limiting the number of Jews who could be admitted to law, medical, journalism, and other professional schools. It was also personal in terms of Jews being bullied and held up to contempt and hostility, not by any means by all of the non-Jewish population, but by a substantial segment, many of whom were members of or followers of the Hungarian version of the Nazi and other racist parties. But this was not the virulent and deadly doctrine of extermination as preached and practiced by Hitler and his thugs, and the anti-Semitic undercurrents running through Hungarian political and cultural life did not significantly affect our everyday life and my basically happy and tranquil childhood. All this changed with a dramatic suddenness on a very specific date, March 19, 1944, relatively late in the course of World War II. I remember the day very well. I was on my way home from a study session in preparation for my upcoming bar mitzvah when a neighbor woman asked me if I had heard the news. When I asked what news, she told me that the Germans had taken over the country and the government. The effect of the Nazi takeover on the Jews of Hungary were immediate and disastrous. I will limit my account to what happened to me, to my family, and to the Jewish community of Tub. Within days following the takeover, the stream of anti-Jewish edicts began. Jews could not travel without specific permission. Soon they could not travel at all. Prominent families in the community, as well as those suspected of subversive activities or associations, began to disappear. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear a prominent yellow star on their outer clothing. I remember the evening before this edict went into effect, my mother sitting in our living room sewing the yellow stars on our jackets and sweaters. By mid-May, all Jews were herded into a ghetto. My family was lucky in that respect, for our home was within the area that was designated as part of the ghetto. But our three-room home, instead of just housing my immediate family, also became home for numerous relatives, as I recall between 18 to 20 persons in all, whose residences were outside the ghetto boundaries. The end of the Jewish community in Tub came during the latter part of June 1944. On 24 hours' notice, we were ordered to be ready for departure in front of our homes with no more than one suitcase per person. 3 images stand out for me from the day on which we were marched down the main street of Tub to the unused brickyard next to the railroad station. The first was the attitude and behavior of the non-Jewish inhabitants. A relatively small number of them stood on the sidewalk as we were herded by and made jeering comments like, "You Jews are finally getting what's coming to you." The great majority of the town people simply retreated into their homes and closed their blinds to shut out the sight of their fellow citizens being driven down the street like cattle. The second image was at the public school of all places on the way to the station, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation at being stripped naked in a crowded room and hand-searched by Nazi thugs. The third was at the brickyard, with only a bare earthen floor for accommodations, where an elderly woman standing up to recite her Sabbath prayers was clubbed bloody and unconscious by one of the guards. From Tub, we were shipped to a collection point about 50 miles away, where we were unloaded onto a large open field. There, we were joined by approximately 7,000 to 10,000 others collected from other ghettos in that part of Hungary. From there, during the first week of July of 1944, we were loaded into cattle cars, between 40 to 50 men, women, and children per car, headed for Auschwitz. We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on approximately July 7. I remember it was a Friday. By the time the sliding door of the freight car, which remained mostly locked throughout the 5-day journey, was opened, there were at least half a dozen corpses or near corpses in the car, and many more whose minds became unhinged. On the train platform at Auschwitz, there was chaos, brutality, and confusion. But my immediate family, my mother, my father, and my younger brother were still together. The first thing that happened as we stood there dazed was an order on the loudspeaker that those in charge of each car, and my father was so designated, so what his function was he never knew, were to report to the authorities. So my father left us, and that was the last time I saw him. Next, an announcement was made that males and females should separate because showers would be given. By now, my mother was quite frightened and told my brother and me to stay with her. I told her that I was not about to take a shower with a bunch of women. She didn't argue with me, but left me with the admonition, whatever you do, make sure that you stay with your brother. With those words, she left us and I never saw her again. Next, all the males were ordered to line up in a single file to be inspected by 2 SS officers. The officers looked at each person as he reached the head of the line, and those who looked able-bodied and fit to work were sent to the right. Those who looked too young, too old, and otherwise unfit for work were sent to the left. My brother, who was just over 10 years old, was in front of me in the line, and the SS officer, without hesitation, sent him to the left. Harking back to my mother's admonition, and without realizing the consequences of my action, I followed my brother to the left. I was about 2 steps past the Nazi when he reached over, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, and shoved me over to the right. To this day, I do not know whether the German thought that I just might be fit and old enough to be able to work, or whether he was simply irritated by the fact that I made my own decision. In any event, that shove from the left to the right made the difference on that day between my ending up in the gas chambers within the hour, as did the rest of my family, and my surviving at least that initial screening. My ordeal obviously did not end with that fateful shove. Every day for the next 10 months until my liberation by the Americans during the first week of May of 1945 was a battle for survival. That battle took several forms. At first in Auschwitz, it was a matter of trying to avoid being sent to the gas chambers. This was because even though I survived that initial screening, I kept flunking the physicals that the prisoners were subjected to in order to qualify for permanent work assignment. And you didn't get the famous tattoo on your arm, by the way, until you were so picked and transferred from Auschwitz-Birkenau to the main Auschwitz concentration camp. So I don't have the tattoo. By mid-September of 1944, I realized that most of those remaining in my barracks consist of the old, the sick, and those like me too young to be selected for work. At that point, in a desperate move that is described in the book, I managed to get into a transport out of Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Ironically, the Mauthausen camp is considered in the annals of the Holocaust as one of the more brutal and deadly camps, but for me it was like a lease on life, because you were killed in a gas chamber only if you were unable to work, not just simply because you looked too weak or too small. From then on, my battle to stay alive was mostly a matter of fighting and trying to survive hunger, cold, brutal beatings, overcrowding, on sanitary conditions and just about every other privation known to man. To illustrate, let me give you a brief picture of a typical day at the Mauthausen concentration camp. I will start with bedtime in the evening. Our sleeping accommodations were triple-decker bunk beds. But instead of one person per bed, we were squeezed 3, sometimes 4 persons per bed. The result was horrible overcrowding, with people fighting with each other for every inch of available space. There was no mattress on the beds, sometimes some filthy ground-up straw, often just wooden boards. One night I offered a deal to my bunkmates. If they let me have the single blanket we were allotted, I would go down and sleep on the floor under the bed and free up some space on the bed. My offer was accepted, and that was a win-win situation in Mauthausen. We were woken up about 6:30 in the morning, mostly with shouts, but if the overseers thought we were not quick enough, then with clubs. Our barracks, housing about 100 men, had 2 faucets and a 3-hole latrine for our sanitation. By 7, we had to be outside the barracks and line up for roll call. We had to stand and wait for the German officer to show up to receive the roll call report from the barracks chief. Sometimes the German would not show up for an hour or more, and we had to stand there in rain or snow or bitter cold until he showed up and received the report. This was during the late fall and winter months, and we only had thin, striped prisoner uniforms for clothing. After roll call, we had breakfast, which consisted of a brown, lukewarm liquid that they called coffee. After breakfast, the able-bodied prisoners were sent out to work details. Since I was small and frail looking, I generally was not picked for work. Instead, all of us who were not picked for work had to stay outside in the often freezing cold. To ease our discomfort, we huddled against each other for body heat. One amusement of the more brutal overseer guards, who were prisoners themselves, by the way, was to start beating the outer layer of this huddled mass with clubs and watch the whole group break into a stampede. In the course of one of these stampedes, my feet got trampled on, resulting in cold sores that never healed during my time in the camps, and I still have the scars on my feet. For lunch, we were served a cup of greasy liquid called soup made out of dried beets, and I hope I won't spoil your lunch with dead maggots floating in the liquid. Our dinner consisted of a slice of bread with a square of margarine or a scoop of jam. During my 10 months of imprisonment, I never had a glass of milk or a piece of fruit. The only exception was one day when we were carrying airplane parts on a public street, and a woman was walking ahead of us eating an apple. She looked around furtively to see that there were no guards looking, and then threw the half-eaten apple on the ground. I was the lucky one who picked up the apple, took a bite, and shared the spoils with my best friend. To add to our misery, the unsanitary conditions resulted in an enormous infestation of lice. We spent much of our days squirming and scratching, and our evenings trying to kill the vermin that were crawling on our clothing. A very large number of prisoners contracted typhus because of the lice, and many of them died of the disease. I too got sick, but fortunately the symptoms did not show up until after I was liberated by the Americans in early May of 1945, where I was cared for and recovered in an American Army field hospital. When I woke up after several days of lying unconscious, I was put on a scale, and at the age of 13, I weighed 26 kilos, or about 52 pounds. After the war, many magazines and newsreels showed pictures of the cadaver-like creatures that emerged from the concentration camps upon liberation by the Allies. I was one of them. People often ask me how we felt when we were liberated. First, I will tell you how we found out that we were liberated. This was during the first week of May of 1945. The weather was cold and miserable. It snowed the day before. We were in a temporary makeshift camp in the middle of a forest. We could hear the artillery explosions not far from us, and the Germans kept driving us from one camp to another to be ahead of the oncoming Allies. The ground outside the barracks was knee-deep in mud. Suddenly, one of the prisoners burst into our barracks, yelling, "Hey, the guards are gone." That's the way we found out that we were liberated. When we realized what was happening, did we burst into tears of joy or dance in the streets, or rather in the knee-deep mud? The answer is no. What we did was to race to the storehouse which contained the maggot-ridden ingredients for our soup, ripped open the sacks, and crammed this noxious stuff into our mouths till we almost choked. I spent the first night of my freedom trying to get some sleep on one of the sacks while the lice were crawling over me and biting me to distraction. With all the brutality and deprivation, there were instances of humanity and selflessness, sometimes from unexpected quarters. Let me give you two examples. The first involved a German soldier who was one of the guards when we were being moved from the Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp. The journey was by train in cattle cars, but the conditions were not nearly as terrible as those in the trip to Auschwitz that I described earlier. There were about 30 male prisoners per car. We had adequate sanitation and water and meager but regular meals. The guard with his rifle was quartered with us in the cattle car. During the first day of the 3-day trip, he was distant and unfriendly. By the second day, he unbent a little and for some reason took a liking to me. By that evening, he offered me some morsels from his dinner, which of course was far superior to what the prisoners had to eat. Later that evening, he asked me to sing some songs that I remembered from my childhood. I felt that somehow in that cattle car, taking me to the next concentration camp, the German soldier and I had formed a bond. The second instance of some light in the dark days of my captivity involved my best friend and me. You could not possibly survive the physical and emotional trauma of the camps without a buddy system, a friend to lean on and give support to and receive support from. In my case, I found a boy about my age in Mauthausen, the second camp I was in, and we both felt that we made a good fit. The name of this boy was Simcha, and there's a picture of the two of us in my book, which was taken shortly after the war. One night in the middle of the winter, someone stole Simcha's shoes while we were sleeping. The shoes were not much. They were basically flip-flops with wooden soles. But they were all we had, and we certainly were better than nothing. So the following morning, Simcha had to walk barefoot through the snow and ice to the factory we were working in about a mile away. While at work, the thief, another bigger boy, came up to us and said, "Guess what? I found your shoes. And if you let me have your day's ration of bread, you can have them back." Simcha and I knew that he could not possibly survive without his shoes, and neither could he survive without his ration of bread. The only solution was to try to make it for the day with a half ration of bread for each of us, and to use the other half to retrieve his shoes. We did this without discussion or question. We both took it for granted that he would do the same for me if it was necessary. People sometimes ask me if there were any good days in the camps. I tell them yes. It was the day I saved my friend's life with a half a slice of bread. Very briefly, I will tell you how I ended up where I am. How a chance encounter in the summer of 1945 changed and gave new direction to my life. By that time, with the war in Europe over, I was in a refugee camp in Italy in the town of Modena. I was alone, just over 13 years old, ragged and hungry. There were thousands of kids like me hustling for an extra piece of bread, or if we were really lucky, some candy or a piece of chewing gum. The only source of those goodies were the American soldiers who were stationed near our camp. So naturally, I spent much of my time hanging out near where the Americans were billeted. As I was standing there one day looking for a hustling opportunity, a Jeep drove up loaded with 4 GIs and their duffel bags. I immediately ran up to the Jeep, headed for the nearest soldier, and with sign language offered my services as a porter. He smiled and pointed to one of the bags. The bag was almost as big as I was, and my employer later told me that all he could see was the bag and 2 bare feet underneath, pumping away with great energy. After I delivered the bag in his room, the soldier gave me a chocolate bar, which for me was the aim and goal of the whole exercise. And we tried to communicate with each other. We discovered that our only means of doing so was broken German. I told him about my situation. The words in German, Mutter, Vater, kaputt, was by then easily sliding off my tongue, and he was visibly moved. For the next 5 days, he spent all of his free time with me, taking me to movies and restaurants, treats I've never had before. We also did a lot of walking and talking. There's a picture in the book of the 2 of us taken by a street photographer. 5 days after I met him, the soldiers was transferred, but we started corresponding with each other. The upshot of this encounter was that after the soldier returned to U.S. and was demobilized, he wrote me a letter offering to bring me to the U.S. and to have me become part of his family. This story by itself is unique enough, but what makes it even more remarkable is the fact that the GI who befriended me happened to be Charles Merrill Jr., the son of the founder of the Merrill Lynch financial empire. The rest, as they say, is history. When Fritz and I embarked on our joint project, my intention was not to send a moral message. My intention was simply to tell my story because I realized that I had some obligations to discharge. First and foremost was an obligation to my 3 children. As they grew up in Orinda, California, they heard bits and pieces of the story, but never in a coherent and systematic way. More importantly, I kept the pain and emotion out of whatever I told them. I realize now this was not as much to protect them as to protect myself. I also owed a debt to the family I lost. My mother, my father, my kid brother, and the rest of my extended family. The story of the Holocaust, how the millions were murdered, has been told many times, but their own story has never been told. I felt that they deserved that be done, and that it was up to me to do it. But even though the story was not told to send a message, I believe that it does so nevertheless. The most important is the need to avoid hatred, bigotry, and intolerance, and to speak out against these destructive tendencies. Finally, my story carries the message of the resilience of the human spirit and the hope for a better world. Thank you.
We're going to have a little Q&A now, so if you want to raise your hand, and then I'm going to repeat the question just so make sure everybody can hear it.
Did you know about the gas chambers?
At what point did you know about the gas chambers?
Well, let me start when we were in the cattle car on our way to Auschwitz. The car had a little square window on the one corner, and I was looking out, just whiling away the time, and my father came up to me and said, "You know, this is the end." And I flared up and said, "What are you talking about? They're just taking us to a place where we'll work, and if we do what we're supposed to do, we'll just be fine." The first camp in Auschwitz where I was less than a quarter of a mile from a building that emitted the blackest acrid smoke most of the day. I just could not accept that in fact what was going on. And I kept sending notes for board details, so went out from my part of the camp to deliver to my mother if they found her. I didn't fully accept what happened actually till about the first week after I was liberated, when I met a man from our town who was part of what they called the Sonderkommando, the special unit that actually herded the people into the gas chamber and then to the crematorium. And he told me that he saw my family being driven into the camp. That is the first time I knew something terrible was happening. I knew that I was getting out of Auschwitz to save myself, but I couldn't accept and couldn't believe what happened. And it was when that man told me that he actually saw members of my family that I finally started accepting the fact. Obviously, I was aware that people by the hundreds were dying of starvation and other disease. Bodies were stacked up in the bathrooms before they were loaded onto the daily truck taking. But I thought that was just the mortality rate instead of what was going on.
How did you feel with did you have any PTSD after surviving the camps? And if so, how did you deal with it?
Did you have any PTSD?
Early after the book came out, somebody asked me that, and I said, "What is that?" And in retrospect, I told them, being when I couldn't afford to have that kind of disease or problem. I had dreams, and even to this very day, recollections. But you couldn't be a tender plant to survive, and I was not a tender plant. If I was, I wouldn't be here.
Bernie, you mentioned that when you were in the cattle car, towards the end, one of the guards that kind of liked you asked you to sing some songs from your childhood to him. Do you still sing? And if you did, would you sing one of them to us?
She's saying that when you were asked to sing by the guard in the cattle car, that you sang for him. Is there a childhood song that comes to your mind right now, and would you sing for us?
Yes, well, it was a song that was quite popular in Hungary, and we all sang it. It's a poem actually by the national poet of Hungary, who lived during the 19th century, when Hungary rebelled against being held as a kind of a subject country by the Austrian Empire. And it's a yearning for home type of a thing, of a young man who leaves his home, and it's a very beautiful poem. And I remember that my mother used to love to sing me songs, and I still remember a fair number of them.
I wondered if he kept in touch with his best friend from the camp.
Did you keep in touch with your best friend from the camp?
Well, for a long time, not. He ended up in then Palestine, which became Israel. As I think I explained during my talk, I distanced myself of the whole experience, and that was, I guess, my PTSD. And but in mid-90s, my wife and I decided to go to Israel, and by then that was a good, well, close to 50 years after the war, and I was struggling with myself whether or not I would try to find him, to get in touch with him. And while in Jerusalem, we went to the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, and I decided to go to the person who kept track, database, and explained, first of all, who I was and what happened. And one of the things I didn't mention specifically, after this grim refugee camp, we were, young kids like me were put in an orphanage, which was run by soldiers, Jewish soldiers from Palestine, who were part of the British army. I went to the lady, and this orphanage has now become a kind of a landmark, historic in all of Israel. And when I told the lady at the museum who I was, he said, "My God, there was a big TV show about Selvino, the orphanage that I was in, And she became energized and said, give me some names, give me some names. And she started calling, and within about 10, 15 minutes, she called my Simcha's home. He was out working. His wife answered the phone. I, of course, didn't meet the wife, but she knew the story, and she said, my God, I don't know how to tell it to him. He'll have a heart attack. And the upshot was that Simcha, who was probably the only person in Israel doesn't speak English, brought his son with him to be a translator. I spoke broken Hebrew and by then broken Hungarian, so having his son there as a translator made a big difference. So we had dinner together at the Hyatt in Jerusalem, and from then on he and I kept corresponding off and on, and he actually came and visited family in the U.S. in about 2005 or 6, and he spent several days at our house, and we remembered what happened.
What was your experience like when you first came to Israel in Jerusalem?
Gentleman is asking, what was your experience like when you first came to Israel?
It was fairly emotional. To me, it's a beautiful city. I don't know if any of you have been to it. It's in Hebrew they call it Jerusalem the Golden, because the sandstone in which most buildings are built have this honey-colored beige look. And it's you can't help thinking history just embraces you all over. One of the trip you go by, and there's a story in the Bible how David, when he was trying to dodge Saul, the King Saul, was hiding in this cave, and he found a fountain. The fountain is still there, and it's just an incredible feeling that how these living things are connected. And it is at that point that I saw, of course, my friend Simcha. It was a very memorable trip.
I wanted to ask, was he familiar with Corrie ten Boom's book and story? And also, does he still have feelings of hatred or revenge for all the atrocities, or does he work through forgiveness, or what are his feelings toward the Germans and Hitler and the things that were done to him and his family?
She's asking, are you familiar with Corrie ten Boom's story? Corrie ten Boom?
I'm afraid not. I mean, there have been so many books written. I am obviously familiar with, I don't know if you have, Elie Wiesel, who wrote Night, and he was a Hungarian Jew too, about my age, maybe a couple years older, and he had to be one cattle car behind or in front of me on the way to Auschwitz. I never met him, but obviously he was a very eloquent person in his book. He's taught in schools. And
she also wondered if you have any hatred and resentment towards the Germans and the Nazis.
That's a little complicated. Right after the war, I had a fair degree of anger, basically against Germans. I remember Charlie Merrill, the man who brought me to the States. We were in Europe, and he had made friends with a German who lived in what was after the war, the Czech Republic, and after what happened and what Hitler did, the Czechs just basically ousted all those ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia. And I remember telling him it couldn't have happened to a nicer bunch. But as time went on, and I did have to come up with a way to cope with everything. And in the course of those reflections, as I mentioned, I am a very strong believer in personal responsibility. Those who participated and aided the Holocaust, I would never forgive. By the same token, people who did not or were not personally responsible. Now, it becomes really a kind of a question that I think I know I ponder at times, and what would you have done if you were a non-Jew and spoke out against those things? And it wasn't like you were unpopular. You could have ended up being arrested or worse. How many of us would have the courage and the commitment to speak out? So Germans knew, obviously, that Jews were being deprived of their civil rights. I think most Germans did not know what was going on in the concentration camps. But again, I don't know how to put myself there, but I keep wondering, just seeing people for no reason other than their race having deprived their rights and treated like pariahs and abused, would you stand up and especially when it was such a dangerous thing to do? I don't know the answer. I don't know what I would do, and I try to avoid judging people for that.
First, I want to thank you for sharing. We've enjoyed hearing you speak, as painful as it is.
Thank you.
I'm a homeschooling mom. I am curious your opinion on history continuing to be taught in the school systems and how important that is, because we're aware of school systems around the world in more liberal areas, New York or Washington, Chicago, pulling history out. So what do you feel on a broad scale, history and children continuing to learn about the Holocaust and Nazis, our ugly history retaining and being, continue to be taught?
She's saying, do you think it's important that children learn all about the Holocaust in schools still?
I'm aware that, I don't know if all states, but most states do have, it's required that you include in the history of World War II what happened in the Holocaust. I have to say something about that. When the book first came out and I started getting requests to talk to young people, I started out with the assumption that youngsters here in the U.S. are so removed in time, place, history, culture from what happened there that they couldn't care less. I was reminded of what the kids do when their grandparents tell them how they trudged their way through the snow and ice to school, and the kids saying, "Oh, give me a break." But I could not have been more wrong. I have spoken to literally hundreds of high school, even middle school young people, and within a few minutes, I kind of explained to them that I was just their age or even younger. They stopped fidgeting and they really listen. I've spoken to at least three schools here in the area already, and I've spoken to hundreds literally over time, and I am so impressed by how attentive they are, and one of my most treasured possessions is a file drawer full of letters, which are more than just the pro forma, thank you for coming to our school. Some of them are so articulate, and I had my old man prejudices about current level of education and the vocabulary of young people. So that's been one of the more gratifying rewards that I've had since I began telling my story.
Thank you for coming and sharing your testimony. Have you been back to your old hometown, and haven't seen anybody there, or any kind of, how is your feeling of that?
Have you been back to your hometown?
Yes, I was. It wasn't as much the people there because of this. First, because of the brutal way that I was separated from my home, and equally importantly, the Cold War, during which time Hungary could have just soon been on another planet. And so it was in 1971 when I first returned to Hungary and visited my hometown. That was another emotional pilgrimage. There's a picture in the book of what was left over from the synagogue, which was a set of ruined steps with, of all things, a chicken coop on top of it, and the weed overgrown cemetery that I had to crawl through the thorny bushes to get inside. That was in 1971. That was, of course, still, it was after the Hungarian Revolution against the Russians in 1956, but it was still during the time that basically Hungary was under communist rule. And as we walked down the main street, my wife and I, late wife and I, you could see the curtains open and furtively people looking out because they just suspected anybody who showed up there. But I visited a total of 3 times, including when the book came out and we were on book tour in Germany. Jan and I went to Budapest and visited my hometown. It's some sort of a kind of a perverse, I don't know, not revenge, but feeling. If you Google the name, the city of Tub in Hungary, you will see that there are well-known residents, and I'm one of them.
I'd like to go back to a comment that I forgot, teacher or somebody made about when you were asked, do you still feel a hatred towards Germans in general? And I have a very personal feeling about this because all my life, well, I've been a German and Spanish teacher for 30 years. And much of my life, I was called the little Nazi because I had a good control over my classroom. And everybody thought that was funny. And I have a real problem with people because my father was Polish and my mother was German. And they took my father, they took the Poles too, of course, and anybody, not normal, not fit. And he was, at the time, a Catholic Polish person, so it had nothing to do with Jewish. But they took him, and they told my mother, who had a baby boy, my brother was born in Germany, and said, I hope you got a good look at him because, and he disappeared. Well, amazingly, 8 months later, he came pedaling on a bicycle and came back home. Many of the Catholic people at that time were very superstitious, and they thought it was his ghost coming back. That was one part of the story. The other part is that my parents were workers. I'm very emotional about this, as you can see. I'm sorry. They were dairy farmers, and they lived way out in the middle of nowhere. And they honestly had no inkling that what was going on. And you brought up that point, and I really appreciated that, because it was not all Germans who even remotely knew about this. And I know this, especially the young kids in this generation, the ones I taught in my schools, you don't understand, if you really don't think hard. There was no internet, there was no TV, there were no radios, there was no transportation. You couldn't just jump on a plane or a train and go somewhere and find out what was going on in the big city. My parents had no idea. They knew, there were trains going by, but they never saw what was happening. And so I've taught this all my life, trying to explain to the American people, or anybody. I've traveled in Europe many times because I have friends all over there and a couple of relatives still. And they just, you need to understand that German people, if you think of what's going on sometimes in this country a little bit, I don't know, we're into politics or anything, but this sort of thing can happen anywhere if people are not paying attention. And that's what I want to bring across. My parents my mother was the kindest, most wonderful person ever, and I miss her every single day. And I heard, like you were saying, bits and pieces, because my father especially did not want to sit down and tell a real story. He just couldn't deal with it. And he still had the scars on his back, centuries, decades later. So I just wanted to say that to make sure that, especially young people, I know that older people have had plenty of time and access to read up on this, and if you care, and find out that Germans were not all Nazis. Please don't ever go home believing that. And if that's one thing I wanted to say, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because of course, I too grew up thinking, how in the world could this have happened? How did you not know? And I actually said that to my mother, who was a German. And I look back and I think, what was I thinking? And then I became part of the Holocaust committee, and we edited the book at Vanderbilt, and so I finally, I don't know how long it took me to grasp that this was not all Germans, just like what's happening in certain parts of America is not all Americans. And you have to keep that in mind. When you see stories about things happening in different countries, it's not everybody in that country. It could possibly be, right? So, and I'm talking too much, but it really hit home, and I appreciate you coming. I have gone to other talks, and as you know, there's so few of you left. And it's so important that you teach the young kids, and I was so thrilled to see so many young people here today.
Well, thank you. First, it is just a fact that some Germans actually did endanger their lives, and many of them were killed for speaking out or certainly helping. Certainly, if you were caught harboring a Jew, your own life would be very much at risk. And at the museum in Jerusalem, there is a segment honoring what's called the righteous Gentiles who risked their lives to save in Poland, in Germany, and in many other countries. And there are human beings who had the courage to do it and risk their lives to do it.
One thing I wanted to add, my mother, like I said, had my brother, and he was about 6 months old or something, very healthy, and because they lived on a farm, so they had food. That was one thing that many Germans didn't have at the time. The ones who lived in the cities, during the war, Germany was decimated. So you had to literally, if you didn't have a room for a garden, you couldn't plant. My point is, she's standing there with this little baby, and they took my father away from her, and they asked her, if you want to put it in that polite term, they wanted to take her to these big manor houses, these former baronial estates, to breed healthy Germans. And of course, she just said, that's, my mother, if you ever knew her, and up to the day she died, she would never join any group, she wouldn't even join a book club. She was so terrified of getting together with a band of people who believed one thing. I know that sounds really weird for people to understand, but she actually was asked, however you want to word that, by the Nazis who came and took my father, if she were willing to come and do this. And some of the German women did, because they had no food. I don't know if that's easy to grasp or not, but they were very well taken care of. And they were used to breed more Aryans. And my mother was dark-haired and dark-eyed, by the way. She was not the typical blue-eyed blonde German. So I just wanted to add that. So I really appreciate it.
I just wanted to ask, did you get a I Survived book written about you?
There's a book series called I Survived. He wondered if there was a book, I Survived, Holocaust, about you, your story.
Well, it's this book.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. You said I think I heard part of the answer to my question in some of your answers, but you said you were raised an Orthodox Jew. And then I wonder, having lived through the Holocaust, where did that leave you with your faith? Did you embrace it more or question it? Or you God?
Since you were raised as an Orthodox Jew,
Yes.
after this experience, where did that leave you with your faith?
Well, that's to a somewhat complex story. During the camps, I obviously could not practice my faith, but I retained my deep sense of religion and belief that there is a higher being, and I am sure that helped me survive those years. After the war, these Jewish soldiers who gathered us and actually ran the orphanage that I was in, they did not by any means try to brainwash, but they wanted to change the image of the Jew from the traditional, particularly in Europe, wearing the side locks and all of the other aspects, and the general, certainly anti-Semitic thing that Jews are cowards, Jews are dirty, they are exploiters, and they wanted to instill a secular Jewishness as opposed to a religious Jewishness in us. In that course, they became my role models. After a while, if you're being told that you are basically inferior and have all these shortcomings, you start feeling it. And so these non-religious Jews who took over and ran, certainly in my case, ran this orphanage, and generally they became my role models, and in the process I parted ways with the religious part. And I hope that explains what you were asking.
All right, thank you so much for coming. And I wanted to follow up on this young man's question that he asked you a minute ago about the I Survive series, because I think he has a very, very, very good point. You've written a terrific book. I've got it on order, and I can't wait to get it. But I think the hope for the future in terms of this kind of thing, avoiding this kind of thing from happening in history, is through reaching children in children's books. And I think that's a very good idea, that you should write a book about the Holocaust in that I Survived series, or I hope that someone has, because I think that that's, in order for this story to continue, it has to be understood and known by children growing up, not just in history books, but in personal stories. The only other thing is my father was a P-51 pilot in Germany, and I've never been, and I've written a book about him, and I've never been so proud of the fact that he flew into Germany bombing the airports and the airfields, and I, although I'm trying not to be a violent person, I am very proud of the fact that he, along with other Americans, did that.
I've got 2 questions for you real quick, Mr. Bernie. First, how did you meet your wife?
How did you meet?
Well, I was married before, and my wife died in her 40s. I met Jan in California. I was at that point single, and I was playing tennis with a group of men and women, and they knew my situation, and I told the ladies that if they knew of somebody simpatico to let me know. And sure enough, one of them said that she just met. Actually, they went to a wedding together, and that she thought I might enjoy meeting her. And being both she and I fairly cautious, conservative type, I did call her, and we made a date to meet at the local Starbucks after my tennis game on a Saturday morning, and she asked me, well, how will I know you? And I said, you'll see this dark, handsome stranger. And instead I said, you'll see this bald, wiry, short guy in tennis outfit. And she had no trouble identifying me.
That's great. And my second question was, you were talking about the song that you sang and the yearning for home and then going to Jerusalem. Was that part of how you found healing?
Well, it was a bond. It was a human gesture in the midst of inhumanity, you might say, that it left such an impression on me.
Thank you for being here today. I have a question and a petition. One question, did you, besides your memories, did you bring any objects that you still remember what happened, or you still have it just to keep it for your memories in the past?
Did you
like
bring
objects?
Obviously, from just memory, I remember there was a large picture in our house with me and a teddy bear. I remember that. I remember the kind of typical, in those days at least, formal pictures of my family, my father, my mother, my kid brother, and I. But they're all memories. When I went back to my hometown, I could identify the house that I spent the first 7 years of my life, and it was an emotional time. I have, when I was 12 when I left Hungary, so I have fairly well-formed memories of things.
And another thing that I would like to ask you, if you can share memory that you remember having with your family.
With my...
before the war?
Before, yeah.
A memory you have with your family before the war.
Oh yes, well, yes. And if you read the book, you will see there's a description. When Fritz and I were working on the book, I tried to recreate what it was like, what my family was like, and our family life was like. I had a very strong bond to my mother, who actually was a teacher for a period, and I might add, we had a library in our school, but the books were so used and overused that they had pages missing. And when I read a book, I remember reading a Jules Verne book. After page 15, it was page 27. And so I had to recreate and imagine what happened between those two pages. And I think that was very helpful to develop my imagination and my ability to live through the things that I read in the books.
Thank you very much for coming. I teach middle school history, and I'm so grateful for your testimony. And one of the questions I have for you is, I'm wondering maybe the psychology behind how could these German soldiers convince entire towns to pack up and get on these trains. How did they convince your parents and your neighbors and all the people? Was it through force, or was it through telling you this is going to be okay, we're just going to move you to this other place? Or were your parents, did they say we need to obey and do what they say, or did people try to fight back and not get on these trains? How did those conversations go down?
She's a middle school teacher, so she teaches history. She's wondering, how did the Germans convince all these people to comply, that they got on a train and they went along with this? How did they get so many?
You mean the victims?
The victims.
To take you from your home onto the train.
Yeah, well, it's normally people are too polite to ask the question, is how could you and the Jews obey and just went to their deaths like cattle? I think it's a fair question. And there are a number of explanations for it. First of all, that was not the norm by any means. I don't know if you're aware, or the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto rose up, and the Germans literally obliterated the ghetto and, of course, killed everybody who participated in the uprising. Jews in countries like Poland particularly went into the resistance. In Hungary, it was a kind of a unique situation, because Hungary, instead of being a conquered country, it was an ally of Hitler, because Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the treaty after following the First World War stripped Hungary of huge chunks of its territory, which was inhabited by non-Hungarians. But they had this resentment of what happened, and they were particularly amenable to the Nazi concept that there was stabbed in the back, and the war. We had to recite in school every day, a mutilated Hungary is no country, a whole Hungary is heaven. That had to be recited in our prayer every day in the school. So, and the Jews of Hungary, particularly the Jews of Budapest, were quite assimilated. And because of the fact that Hungary had its own version of anti-Semitism, but it was not, as I said, the virulent kind. Many Jews tried to assimilate and thought that they are going to escape the fate of what happened to the Jews in Poland and in the other countries which were conquered by Germany. And that's why the beginning of the Holocaust for Hungary started quite late in the war, in March of 1944, just barely a year before the end of the war, because until then Hitler in fact left Hungarians alone. Another factor was that the core of what could be as a resistance, namely young males, were conscripted into labor camps and were not there to mount. They would be the ones that would generally be the seed, at least, of any resistance movement. The rest, grandmothers and people who lived all their lives in peaceful conditions, they just couldn't conceive that all this was happening. And the Nazis very carefully, as I mentioned, the episode between my father and me in the cattle car, kept saying, all we want to do is for you guys to go and work, and if you work and you do what you're told, you're going to be okay. So there was a lot of denial. By then we knew from just the few people who escaped, like Poland. I remember early in the war, they were at our synagogue and gave this tearful account of what was happening. And I'm sorry to say our reaction was, this is awful, but thank God it's not happening to us. So there was a denial. I think the three fact that a population that was deprived of the people who would start this kind of a resistance, the fact that whatever faults, and I'm not saying they were faultless in their way of living, but violence and was not part of the Jewish culture, and denial. I think those three factors caused and enabled this to the picture of these people being driven down the main street without any protest, and is my explanation. It's not something I read, it's my own experience and my own feeling of what happened. And that is why, by the way, that when we were liberated, these Jews who were in the British Army, who showed the exact opposite of a passive, compliant group, appealed to me as much as it did.
On the day that you were liberated, and then the following days, what did they do? What did that look like? Did they just come in and
who, the Germans or the Nazis?
No. When everything was over with, and I know you said y'all ran to the place to get food. How did they take care of you?
Well, it was basically there were a lot of organizations, the United Nations and the U.S. Had organized. I mean, here was this, I don't know, millions, certainly hundreds of thousands of totally destitute people, and they organized refugee camps. There were refugee camps all over Europe right after the war, and the conditions were certainly not luxurious, but first you didn't have to worry about being sent to the gas chamber. Second, they gave you food. And at this orphanage that I described, it was an attempt to rebuild a life and to heal. It was what was being done there on a human basis, but on a larger basis. And there were lots of Jewish organizations from the U.S. that contributed resources to feed and to house the refugees. I hope that explains it.
My question is, when you were in captivity, what did you think about during the day? Like, how did you cope with the day-to-day in your mind?
Well, yeah, I think I understand the question. To be quite honest, food was the when you're hungry, you know, beatings and all these other discomforts are not total and overwhelmingly every hour. Hunger is with you every minute of the day. And we would talk about all the meals that we used to have, and some people hoped that maybe they'll have such thing after. Basically, you went, or at least I did, and I think those who survived went into a survival mode. You had to shut out what was happening around you and put your head down and just work your way through it. And try to deal with the most basic human needs. They pretty well dehumanized you.
In all that I've read and studied about World War II history, I've never read about a Jewish survivor, refugee being adopted by an American soldier. Was that more common than what I've known, or was it very uncommon?
I think what happened to me was pretty uncommon. I think that there were certainly during the war and before the war, when the Nazi regime, there were movements, and actually the Nazis cooperated with letting young kids get out of these areas occupied by the Nazi regime, and they were not necessarily adopted, but maintained and supported by families in England. England was a big recipient of young people who were, before the actual shooting war started, were able to get out of these countries, mostly from Germany, and they were cared for. I keep telling people that given where I was, when I was born, where I was born, the fact that I ended up in Auschwitz was also almost inevitable. But that I would happen to pick up the duffel bag of this GI in Italy, post-war Italy, that was totally unexpected. And as the book, and Fritz called it, The Miracle of Modena, which was the town where this refugee camp was. I can't tell you that, no, but first of all, there were also families, a lot of families in the US particularly, who helped survivors after the war to come to the US, and they either lived with the other family or were supported and start their new life. But I think what happened to me was fairly unique.
Thank you for speaking to my children.
Well, thank you very much.
Let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks very much.